Thank you, Engelbert. I also want to thank the organizer for giving this incredible opportunity to be here. I really feel honored to be in front of you guys. I have to warn you, even though I love maths and equations, you won't see any of them, and you won't see any balance sheet or matrix either. I am very, very sorry about that. The presentation I want to do will focus on the methodological aspect and why do I believe that the approach is interesting in helping us pushing the post-Keynesian agenda and post-Keynesian economics rather than saying we're focusing on the assumptions and the behaviors that we have. Okay, so this is the SFC community in 2013, in January 2013. What I've drawn there are all the authors that have written an SFC paper starting in the 80s in the 1980s up to 2013 in January. Each author is a red dot or a green dot, and if the author have collaborated on a paper with another one, then there's a connection between the two. And the green dots are authors that have had more than 5 publications by January 2013. This is how it looks like now. So what you see is that obviously there's many, many, many more papers. This also explains why I haven't been able to read all of them. While in the survey we did in 2013 with Gianluca Versace, we actually did read all of them. So either I've become more lazy, or it's just that there's more and more papers being published and written. The second thing that we observe as well is that the connectedness of most of the networks here and subnetworks has increased, leading to more and more collaboration between the different authors. And I think that's one of the important points that I want to highlight. It's an amazing tool to actually start discussing with others and collaborating. So what do I want to do today? Well, I'll try to explain from a more historical perspective how did the approach emerge and made such a boom and increased so much. I will highlight a few interesting points in terms of contribution to the post-Keynesian literature, and finally I'll have a word about the future and how I envisage the future of post-Keynesian and SFC modeling. It is important to know that this is all my personal view on it, and well, obviously I'm open to suggestions and comments about that. Okay, so we've seen in the two first graphs that there has been a large increase in papers being published and people working on SFC modeling. In the paper published in the CJE in 2015, but we had written this in 2013. We were stating with Eugenio that we thought that the approach has reached its maturity. There has been a development phase in the 80s and 90s, which led to the book being published by Godin and Lavoie in 2007, and then again an expansion until 2013. But our impression at that time was that the approach was ready to embrace and start diffusing itself quite a lot. And to our understanding, it was made because there were 3 clear value added to the stock flow consistency approach. And I'll detail them right now, but the idea that stock flow relevance was fundamental and was actually highlighting important dynamics. The fact that it was a common framework and which would spur discussion and comparison between different models, and the fact that the tool could be used as a convergence tool between different schools of thought. Of course, as you've seen, the paper, the approach has been used quite a lot and has been used in many different topics and issues, but it remains confined, and let's not kid ourselves, we're still a small community. We had a summer school organized in Kingston in August, and at some point I thought that if a bomb explodes, that half of the community was dead, and that still says something about it. And we might discuss why is it the case that it's still confined. It might be about the fact that we maybe are working into a dispersed field, or I'll address some other limitations just in a minute. Okay. The first most important one, stock and flows. And I won't enter too much the debate about the names. I think there has been enough contribution, and I think we probably all agree. The names is actually undermining us more than it actually helping us. And it actually undermines the strength of the approach. Because while it's quite easy to actually ensure stock flow accounting, if you want, making sure that all the flows have an origin and a destination and that all the stocks are the results of all the flows coming in and coming out, it is, and rightly many papers and many models could claim to be stock flow consistent, the stock flow relevance or the stock flow connection is much more important. The fact that you cannot have a stock growing forever without having a response to that. The fact that stocks are not the subordinate of any optimization behaviors allowing you to lead to a higher level of utility. Stocks are important and as themselves should be accounted for. And there is a relationship between stocks and flows. And so, well, the name is there and we can't change it, it's too late, but I really believe that we have to push more about the importance of this stock flow relevance rather than stock flow accounting. The second thing which I think is fundamental and actually has helped the approach to thrive is the fact that we have a common framework, language and norms. If you go to any paper published, you'll always find a transaction flow matrix and a balance sheet. Obviously, the matrices can be big and small, and you have lots of differences, but the fact that you start with the same kind of concepts is fundamental. It allows us to ease the exposition of somewhat complex models, and obviously we'll have, I'll present other tools that allow you to go further into that ease of exposition. It also allows to compare models more easily. One of the reasons why the agent-based approach has difficulties to thrive as much as the stock flow approach is because it's very complicated to compare models. And if you were to do that, you actually would spend few days to actually try to understand what is the common root between two models. And because of this usage of common framework, language, and norms, it's also very easy to replicate models. Most of the tools that allow you to simulate models actually are based on a list of equations. And so it's fairly easy to take this list of equations and play it at home, and you don't have to rely on sophisticated tools. The second thing which I believe it's very important why these common framework, language, and norms are there, it's actually a tools for structuring thought. And there's a few papers there that actually explain that even if you don't build a model, thinking about balance sheets and thinking about transaction flows actually help you structuring your thought quite a lot. So you don't have to like the math to still do a stock flow consistent model. And actually, I think the paper of Passarella doesn't have any equation. The second point which I want to make here is it's a tool for convergence. It has been highlighted by Mark in 2008, and we picked up on the argument with Eugenio. It could be used to facilitate comparison and comparison and a way to converge towards common policies and so on. And it has been used within post-Keynesian economics by looking at Kaleckian and Kaldorian approaches, or by looking at the theory of Tobin Godin and the Cambridge corporate model, recently done by Javier Bernardo in Kingston, or between schools of thought, combining post-Keynesian and Schumpeterian approaches, or contrasting different closure, as Scott and Ryu have done in 2007, or even as Edwin Leheron has done, comparing different theories and monetary theories. But the second thing also is that the data is the same, and because the stock flow approach is based on national account system, it's actually fairly easy to then to use this stock flow approach to compare and contrast different countries. Just to give you an example, this is Godley's combined fiscal trade ratio versus GDP. So the combined fiscal trade ratio measures combines the measure of the fiscal, the trade deficit or the trade account and the fiscal deficit or the balanced budget. And if the budget is balanced and if the trade balance is balanced, then GDP and the fiscal trade ratio should be the same. And what you can see here is that there's a few change in trends happening in the different economies. For example, in Germany, at around the century, the growth of the fiscal trade ratio was much slower and then picked up dramatically. Or what you can look at Ireland and seeing that even though GDP take a hit, the trend in the fiscal trade ratio was still growing, and which might explain why Ireland actually picked up after the crisis, while Greece or Spain haven't yet. So these show that because of the usage of these national accounts and the fact that now Eurostat and the Fed are providing the data into very normalized way, it's actually fairly easy to replicate analysis for different countries. Okay, I've been praising a lot the approach, but what would be the limitation? Well, the first one, and that's one of the critiques I hear the most, is the number of equations. Obviously, there's a lot of behavioral equations or accounting identities, and once you have a model with 80 to 200 equations, it's fairly complex to present all of them in a paper. And so the question I'm raising here, and I would clearly plead guilty of liking the math too much, is can we actually try to change that subtly? Can we actually try to find a synthesized way to presenting the models and to stay away from the traditional way of presenting these models? The second point on the limitation is something which I also am struggling with. Most of the models you'll see start with a steady state or stationary state and then shock the model and look at what happens then. While I don't have particular problem with that, the question is it a valid choice? Could we actually start with not a stationary state, have a baseline scenario where we explain the dynamics and then compare with a policy scenario? And thus not constraining the economy to be on a steady state, stationary state. And here I don't have an answer, but I know that many authors have been working on the idea of not working with steady stationary state. The third critique I've heard quite a lot is that these models might be too complex or sometimes too complicated. And there I have, the answer I would give is the following. In some case, trying to understand complex dynamics will require you to actually spend a lot of time on the empirics, for example, gathering data, running a complicated econometric analysis, and after 2-3 years, you actually probably will be able to understand the complex dynamics that are at the heart of what you're trying to analyze. Well, building a model is the same. It is a complicated process. Understanding all the feedback mechanisms you have in the model is the same, so you will not gain any time. It's a different way of trying to understand the dynamics, and in my perspective, it's something which suits me well because I'm allowed to do what I would call backward engineering. If the model is not reacting the way I thought it would be, I can actually go and look at the different balance sheet and the different causal structure that are in the model and say, okay, maybe it's something which is counterintuitive. I'm going to have to think about the behavioral equation, and I'm going to have to think about the structure of the model. So yes, it is complex and sometimes complicated to run these models and to build them, but it's a tool to actually understand deeper what you believe to be the representation of the world in which we live. So yes, complex SFC models are complex and complicated tools, but this is because the issues we're trying to tackle are complex. And so it's probably one of the valid tools to try to analyze this. The last point, which I think that might be hindering the diffusion of the approach, is that Mark and Wynne Godley have written this amazing book, the Bible of SFC modeling, if you want, which lays out the methodology and the framework. And so it's an amazing book for entering the approach, but in a way, they made it too easy. It looks amazingly easy to read the book, and because all the codes are on Gennaro's website, it's easy to run them. But actually, when you start doing the model, it's actually much more complicated. And in a way, we probably need to have a more practical references, maybe developing courses, online courses, maybe dedicating, creating softwares that would allow us to ease the development of the models. And of course, I think the community building is very important. I've been and others have been trying to do this by having summer school, winter schools, workshops, and so on. But here, I cannot stress it enough. I think it's only by talking to each other that the practical know-how is going to develop more and more. Okay, so let me just have a few examples, and these are only a few of them, and I think there's many more contribution that the stock flow consistent approach has done to post-Keynesian economics and to economics in general, and I choose two that I like the most. And again, here I'm very guilty of choosing what I like doing. The first one is on agent-based. We had yesterday an amazing presentation by Michael Hoss about behavioral economics and agent-based modeling. And I think that the stock flow consistent approach has brought, aside from obviously creating post-Keynesian features and demand-driven and so on and so forth, has allowed the agent-based models to go towards a more financialized or more focus on credit and finance. Interestingly, the EURES project, which has been running for a few years now, we're doing ABSFC models without knowing it. And they hadn't discovered Mark and Wynn books, and then later on actually started calling them ABSFC models. But then the papers developed in Ancona or in Pisa shows that the fact that we combine the two approaches allow us to work further on the role of credit and of finance on the real world. But also, the combination of the two approaches has allowed AB models to focus more also on more post-Keynesian debates and theories. And Pascal Sepéché and his collaborators in Paris have been working a lot on trying to understand, okay, what are the motivation for what are the post-Keynesian assumptions. For example, his latest paper on learning is very interesting, but there's plenty of paper where he really focuses on specific post-Keynesian hypotheses. Two papers I've been working on with Alessandro Caiani and others, and then with Joris Kasvoort and Dirk Bezemer, are on the role of credit. The first paper was on endogenous monetary and credit, and then with Yuri, and we're working on the monetary policy transmission channels. And we're joining what Philip Arestis and Malcolm Sawyer have been saying for a long time, but we are actually showing it. How is it that it's so slow to actually have any impact of monetary policies? The second topic which I think the SFC framework has helped is ecological. The first one is, the first contribution clearly there is that it offers an explicit framework. And Peter Jackson and his co-authors, but also what Yanis Dafermos and Maria and Jorgos have been showing is that the SFC frameworks allows to combine nicely themes that are important to ecological economics, such as the flows of materials and energy. When I met with some of the IPCC guys when I was presenting on the climate part, I was presenting the stock flow approach, and they were saying, but this is exactly what we're doing. And so I think there's a clearly a rejoining on climate change modelers and economists, and so it's a tool that clearly helps us in talking with them. The second part that are more related to finance and banking. So the SFC world, by combining it with ecological, has shown that finance is actually playing an important role in climate change mitigation and in the transition toward a carbon-free or lower carbon emission economies. And work by Campillo or by 5 minutes, yeah. A final point on that topic is the importance of path dependency and irreversibility of capital. And there, again, these are topics that the post-Keynesians are quite keen on working with. I'm going to have to increase the speed of my speech. Some recent interesting contributions lie on empirics and estimation and calibration. There's a very interesting paper by Chufo and Rosenberg published in Egypt last year, where they explain how domain exploration and numerical stability can be done. But mostly, I think that the most recent interesting contribution is the empirical / estimated models. Obviously, we know that the work that the Levy model has been doing for over a decade there, and the amazing work they've been doing on the US and Greece. And recently, two models on the UK economy, one published by the Bank of England, on which I collaborated, and then one developed by Graham Godin and Ken Coutts in Cambridge. And I think there we would also benefit from talking more with the historical, structural, and econometric models and the techniques they've been using in the past. One of the contributions, I think, which is the most interesting, is that the SFC has allowed us to start, and it's not only the SFC, obviously, has allowed us to engage with the mainstream. I think the SFC highlights the fundamental difference in the way post-Keynesian and the mainstream treat time. If you think about a mainstream model with intertemporal optimization, perfect foresight, and backward-looking, the way they treat time is they know what the future will be, or they impose the future and then bring it back to the present. The stock flow consist model works completely differently. It's based on historical time, and the future will be the realization of the current period and the subsequent short-term periods. And this fundamental treatment of time, and obviously it has been said in the past before by post-Keynesians, but this is explicit. When you see the way we treat the models, the SFC approach is completely different to the mainstream. As I said, we probably need to also to reconnect with large structuralist econometric model, and that's where we can have fruitful conversation with the mainstream. We probably need to work more on the justification of behavioral rules. I'll go partly over that. And then finally, I think the Lucas critique can be partially answered by the usage of stock flow norms. If we accept that we're working on the fundamental uncertainty, stock flow norms are actually quite nice regularities, which are constant over time, and thus would allow us to respond partially to the Lucas critique if we have to respond to that. One of the last important contribution, I think, that SFC is in terms of didactics. In terms of didactics, with allowing that, in didactics of interaction with economists, mainstream and less, and here the work by Dirk Bezemer on showing the difference between stocks and flows. In interacting with students, and I've been using the SFC models at undergrad and postgrad levels, and there's plenty of tools to have us doing that. And in interaction with policymakers. And again, here the work we've been doing with the Bank of England and shows the importance of visualization. And I'm going to end it very quickly with this. I think that there's plenty of tools that allow us to show better the results of SFC models. For example, the Sankey diagrams that show the different kind of flows that have an economy, the relative size, and who's paying for it on the left-hand side and who's receiving the flows on the right-hand side. But also the graph representation that allows us to discover the causality structure. This is the Bank of England model. Well, you can't read it, obviously. I can explain to you what is in there. But what is interesting is we can do a causality structure. What happens when we change the capital adequacy ratio? This is the response by the banking sector. They change the targets. Then what will happen is, as they change the targets right here, they will change the interest rate settings. And then finally, when the interests have changed, this is what happens. The disposable income of households and the firm's decision to invest. So what you see is that even the model is very complex, and I'll give you that, there are tools that allow us to understand the causal structure and that allow us to show to policymakers what's going on in the economy and how the economy reacts to these shocks. I will skip on that, but I think there's a lot of tools that allow us to have dynamic interactions. Yeah. See, I'm very fast. No, I think what is important here is that the value of the approach is proportional to its ability to answer pertinent policy questions and highlight areas where the mainstream can't. And I'm not here to say that we should replace the mainstream, and we should show ourselves as valid alternatives and complementarity to what the mainstream offers us. Thank you.